in the summer of 1988, a U.S. Navy warship called the USS Vincennes was patrolling the Persian Gulf tense, hair trigger, in the middle of an active combat zone. The crew, overwhelmed by the chaos of a naval engagement, made a catastrophic error. They fired a surface-to-air missile at what their systems told them was an Iranian military aircraft. It was not. It was Iran Air Flight 655, a commercial passenger jet. 290 people died. The United States called it a tragic mistake. Iran called it a war crime. The captain of the Vincennes was later awarded a medal. And Iran never forgot. That was 38 years ago. And tonight, the Strait of Hormuz is, once again, the most dangerous 21 miles of water on the face of this earth. Here's why I'm telling you this tonight. Because the story of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz, in the last 24 hours, is not just a breaking news alert. It is not just a headline. It is the product of decades of unresolved grievance, of strategic miscalculation, of two nations who have spent nearly 40 years circling each other in that narrow passage of water, each one convinced the other will blink first. And tonight, nobody blinked. Let's walk through exactly what happened, because the sequence of events matters enormously here. It begins with a decision made in Washington this past Sunday. President Trump announced via Truth Social a military operation called Project Freedom. The premise, on its surface, sounds almost reasonable. The United States would deploy naval power to escort stranded commercial ships safely through the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has effectively blockaded since late February. 15,000 U.S. service members, guided missile destroyers, over 100 land and sea-based aircraft, unmanned platforms. The full weight of American military projection pointed at a 21-mile choke point. Now, Iran had already warned this would happen. They had stated clearly that any attempt to break their maritime blockade would be treated as an act of aggression. And on Monday morning, when U.S. warships began their transit, Iran says it issued multiple radio warnings. The U.S. ships did not turn around. What happened next depends entirely on who you ask. Iran's state-aligned Fars news agency reported that a U.S. Navy frigate was struck by 2 missiles after ignoring Ho's warnings that the ship was unable to continue its route and forced to retreat. U.S. Central Command responded almost immediately, posting from its official account. No U.S. Navy ships have been struck. 2 statements, diametrically opposed, both issued by governments with every reason in the world to shape the narrative in their favor. What we know with far greater certainty is what came next. Iranian cruise missiles targeting U.S. Navy destroyers and commercial vessels were intercepted and shot down. U.S. attack helicopters destroyed 6 Iranian fast attack boats in the strait. 2 American flag merchant vessels made it through. And the violence did not stay in the strait. Iran launched drone and missile strikes deep into the United Arab Emirates, hitting Fujairah, one of the most strategically significant oil ports in the world, precisely because it sits outside the strait and represents one of the few remaining export routes for Middle Eastern oil that doesn't require passing through Iranian-controlled waters. The UAE called it a serious escalation. Schools across the Emirates have shifted to remote learning through Friday. A South Korean cargo vessel suffered an explosion and fire in its engine room, cause still unconfirmed. And somewhere in all of this, a fragile ceasefire that had been holding shakily barely for roughly 4 weeks began to collapse. And here's the part that I want you to sit with for a moment, because here is what this story is actually about underneath the missiles and the fast boats and the competing claims about who struck whom. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of the world's oil supply, 20% on a normal day. And it has been, for the better part of 2 months now, effectively closed. The historic energy supply shock this has triggered is not a future projection. It is happening right now. Oil prices climbed 6% in a single session this week before easing slightly. Global markets are rattled. And the countries most vulnerable, not the United States, not Iran, are the developing nations, the import-dependent economies, the places that do not have strategic petroleum reserves to draw down while great powers play chess in the Gulf. When Trump launched Project Freedom, he was not simply escorting merchant ships. He was making a geopolitical declaration. The United Saint ATS will decide what transits this waterway. Iran heard that declaration the same way they heard it in 1988, and they responded accordingly. The question that nobody in the mainstream conversation is asking loudly enough tonight is this: what is the off-ramp? Not the military off-ramp, the diplomatic one, because there is an Iranian proposal on the table, 14 points, conveyed through Pakistan, and Trump has indicated he will probably reject it. One round of face-to-face peace talks has occurred. Attempts to schedule a second have failed. And meanwhile, the military tempo is accelerating. Let's be precise about what we're looking at here, because precision matters when the alternative is panic. This is not yet a full-scale resumption of war. The ceasefire, such as it is, has not been formally declared over by either side. But what we are watching is the systematic erosion of the conditions that made that ceasefire possible. Every missile fired, every fast boat sunk, every oil terminal struck moves both governments further from the political space they would need to occupy in order to negotiate seriously. And there is something else worth noting. The United States is open, raiding what amounts to a naval blockade of Iranian ports, an act that, under international law, is traditionally considered an act of war. Iran is doing the same to the Strait. Both sides are simultaneously blockading each other while insisting they are acting defensively. That is not a stable equilibrium. That is a logic that historically has a known destination. What the mainstream coverage is underplaying tonight is the institutional stress this places on American allies in the region. The UAE has now been struck by Iranian missiles. Their schools are closed. Their oil infrastructure is on fire. They are a close U.S. partner, and they are being punished in real time for that partnership. At what point does the coalition math change? At what point does a Gulf state government watching its territory absorb Iranian strikes decide that quiet accommodation with Tehran is preferable to continued exposure? Zoom out further, and the picture becomes even more consequential. This conflict, which began on February 28th of this year with U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on Iran, did not emerge from nowhere. It is the culmination of years of escalating pressure, nuclear brinkmanship, proxy warfare across the region, and a fundamental failure of diplomatic architecture. The institutions designed to manage great power conflict in the Gulf, the agreements, the back channels, the mutual understandings have been, piece by piece, dismantled or abandoned over the last decade. What we are living through right now is what happens when deterrence erodes slowly and then all at once. The Strait of Hormuz has always been the place where the abstract tensions of Middle Eastern geopolitics become concrete and immediate, where the price of strategic miscalculation is measured not in diplomatic cables, but in burning tankers and rising fuel costs and closed schools in countries that have nothing to do with the dispute at hand. For ordinary Americans and for people around the world, this story is not distant. It shows up at the gas pump. It shows up in shipping delays and supply chain disruptions. It shows up in the defense budgets that consume resources that might otherwise address domestic needs. And it shows up in the quiet, uncomfortable question that every escalation in this conflict forces us to ask: how close are we, actually, to something that cannot be walked by? AC, Trump has warned that Iran will be blown off the face of the earth if American vessels are attacked. That is the language of maximum pressure. It is also the language that leaves very little room for the kind of quiet, face-saving compromise that has historically allowed adversaries to de-escalate without either side appearing to lose. So here are the two questions I want to leave you with tonight. First, if both the United States and Iran are simultaneously claiming victory in the Strait of Hormuz, and both sides are simultaneously blockading each other, what does a negotiated settlement actually look like? Who moves first? And who, politically, can afford to? And second, the UAE has now been struck multiple times by a country the United States is theoretically protecting it from. At what point does that calculus shift? And if Gulf state support for the American mission quietly erodes, what does Project Freedom look like without a coalition? In 1988, after the USS Vincennes shot down that Iranian passenger jet, the United States and Iran did not go to war. They came close. They pulled back. And for decades afterward, the Strait of Hormuz became something like a symbol O. F how much two adversaries could hate each other and still choose, just barely, not to cross the final line. Tonight, that line feels closer than it has in a very long time. The strait is narrow. The margin for error is narrower still. We'll be watching